The 8th of June, 1973, the 19th stage. Whoever goes faster will win. Eddy Merckx said it, and he was someone who spoke of victories for a good reason. It's a simple sentence to describe a complex sport like cycling. Eddy Merckx, also known as the Cannibal, was really fast. So much so that he dominated entire seasons, signed his name in indelible ink on some years and even certain specific days, and adding his name to the list of greats on two-wheelers. It was said, copy was greatest, Merckx was strongest. And in fact, since he took to the streets, anyone who came later had to deal with his legacy. Few sports are made up of their heroes like cycling is. And cycling is definitely made of Eddy Merckx. A man that was faster than the others, and won. The mountain has a simple rule. If you want to go further, you can't go around it. You have to get to the top. This is in Cima, the greatest Giro d'Italia climbs. Produced by Dogge in association with Agenzia ICE for an appreciation of the best that Made in Italy has to offer. Episode 8, Passo Giau, where Merckx, the Cannibal, showed his human side. (1970, 72, and 74). These were the golden years, those in which the Cannibal won both the Giro and the Tour. In 1973, he had to settle for the Corsa Rosa, but he did so in his own way anyway, keeping the jersey from the first to the last day. However, that was also the last year in which the Belgian dominated. From the next, things would be different despite his double victory. But no one knew that yet. In 73, he was the undisputed champion of all time, competing in the Giro after doing well in the Vuelta of Spain and the Nordics, the Tour of Flanders, Paris-Roubaix, and Liège. It wasn't enough for him. In the Giro, he ran to win and to get that victory too. It was the fourth time that he faced the Bel Paese, and he was the main character there. He stayed at the top of the standings from the first to the last day. Legend has it that he wore the Maglia Rosa in his hotel at night. A feat that previously had only been achieved by Girardengo in 1919 and Binda in 1927. But they didn't wear the jersey because at the time it didn't exist yet. And the Cannibal also won several stages, between Cologne, Aosta, Andalo, just to name a few. That year there was little room left for the others, confirming the reasons that had led the public and journalists to give him that nickname, invented by the daughter of a teammate, Christian Raymond. It was 1969 when the little girl asked why Merckx always won. After hearing the answer, because he's the best, she simply replied, "Then he is a real cannibal." A certain Francesco Moser, a rookie, could show the talent he has between Bolsena and Florence. Felice Gimondi made himself known on the Forte dei Marmi time trial. Between Milan and Iseo, it was Gianni Motta's turn to show off. But the 56th edition remains that of the Cannibal, and of the Belgians in general, who won 13 stages. Confirming for the umpteenth time what he demonstrated since 1966. The year in which he'd inflicted a painful lesson on those who raced to win the Milan-San Remo. By going faster and winning. Easy as that. There are two moments and two races that define Eddy Merckx's magnificent parable, and they are both Italian. The first, in fact, is the Milan-San Remo, the first race of the season, the one that took the athletes back to the road on the descent towards the sea. The year was 1966, and Gimondi and Adorni were lined up at the start, then Altig and Durante. And then there was a 20-year-old in a black and white jersey wearing the number 131. He had 288 kilometers to run ahead of him, and no experience with such long races in his history. They started from Via Ascanio Sforza, Milan, followed the Naviglio, and crossed the southern part of Lombardy, heading towards rocky Liguria. The young man with an unpronounceable name stayed in the leading group, and when the finish was near, he saw Van Springel take off. He decided not to let him go. In the final sprint, there were 4 of them, close together, looking for space for the last sprint, the one that could give meaning to many hours of effort, and it was only him who slithered forward, relentless. There was something bold and almost incredible in that victory of that very young man who left people like Durante behind, who, in fact, someone would see cry, and did so with the scientific rigor of the champion. He already had everything, they wrote about him. And they were right. In fact, the undisputed era of the Belgian began from the Milan-San Remo. Belgium. He was born there, a few tens of kilometers from Brussels, just after the end of the Second World War. Then, his father had left the countryside to move to the city. He took over a grocery store and business was good. No, he didn't get on his bike to help out his parents by doing small jobs like other champions, born and raised in humble contexts. For him, it was child's play. Although it was clear that there was a special feeling between him and his 2 wheels. He could be seen hurtling down the street, and the neighbors were shouting, "Tour de France!" almost prophetically. His first competition was at the age of 12, after having cheered for the great champions as a spectator, and then at 16 years old, he entered the official ones. That's when Merckx discovered the climbs. That's right, because his native Belgium is flat. There are no mountains there. But the end of the 1973 Giro took place on the mountains. That was another important moment in Eddy Merckx's career. That year, Torriani, wearing the Maglia Rosa, expected an itinerary that looked to Europe, with a departure outside the borders, precisely from Belgium. The first stop was in Verviers, with Princess Paula of Liège. Then they moved on to Holland, Germany, Luxembourg, France, Switzerland, and they crossed the Alps, went down into the peninsula until they would return to those same Alps at the end of the competition. June the 8th, 1973, they arrived in Auronzo di Cadore, in the province of Belluno. It was another novelty of the Giro, a stage included for the first time by Torriani, always looking for challenges capable of amazing. There were good climbers in the race. All that was needed was to give them the right slopes. They'd have to tackle Passo Valles, Colle Santa Lucia, Passo Giau, and Passo Tre Croci. Passo Giau certainly commanded respect, with its 2,233 meters of altitude and 9.9 kilometers at 9.3% gradient. High up in the heart of the Dolomites, they would race on a dirt road traced to connect Val Cordevole with Val Boite. That was the point of contact between Cortina d'Ampezzo, Selva di Cadore, and Colle Santa Lucia. It was high in the mountains, with all the expected, unexpected events, for better or for worse. Twice over the years, it had been Cima Coppi. Once, in 2013, they decided not to go there due to bad weather. It froze in winter, the sun beat down in summer, and it could easily turn into an inhospitable place at any other time of the year. It's a landscape of extraordinary beauty for those who have enough energy to look up from the road. You can climb through evergreen forests right to the top. You really feel on top of the world up there. It was the last mountain to face before descending, heading east and finally reaching Trieste. It was the last climb of the year, one of those where the strongest can decide to press on and leave the group behind. Merckx followed this strategy, but he wasn't alone. His opponent of a lifetime, Felice Gimondi, was also there. However, he arrived on the slopes of Passo Giau several minutes late. He could have legitimately aimed for victory if Merckx hadn't once again found himself in front of him. The Belgian, it was always him. He was more than an adversary, an undisputed rival in his career. Because Felice Gimondi had made a dazzling start to his career, showing all the qualities needed to win. And he would have done it, if only that rider capable of really winning hadn't shown up. In 1965, Gimondi had been together with Adorni, whom he followed, in the first positions of the Giro, doing so well that it was decided to let him race the Tour as well. 2 years later, he won in Italy. People are all for him. They see their knight in him, wrote Gianni Mora after Gimondi held his own at Anquetil between Trento and Tirano. A very tough high mountain stage where those who are not champions fought, above all, to get to the finish line. His name could have resonated differently in the history of cycling if it hadn't been for Merckx, who, with his arrival, cursed Gimondi the champion to become Gimondi II. And it wasn't easy to accept. "I knew how to value a second place," he would say, showing a greatness that can't be measured only with a stopwatch in his climbs. And the second place, in fact, would also be his in 1973. In addition to Gimondi, however, there was another cyclist who would challenge the unbeatable one, or at least try. It was José Manuel Fuente, a Spaniard known as the Chamois for his agility, and also as El Terango, the carefree one. He was an Asturian, and he not only grew up among the climbs of that Spanish region, but for him, the bike was also an instrument of social redemption, having been born into a peasant family. The differences between the cannibal and the chamois were many. The former started off with a bang. The latter began quietly. In 1971, he showed his skills as a climber in the Tour and in the Giro, preparing to give his best in the following 2 seasons, with a second place in the Giro, a third in the following Tour, 2 high placements in the Vuelta. And it was precisely after the victory in Spain that he arrived at the Giro in 1973, and his fate met that of the Belgian. There, on Passo Giau, Fuente decided not to resign himself to the superiority of his opponent. In the previous stage, he tried to attack on Monte Bondone, but the Belgian had recovered on the descent and then held on to Paganella. The next day, Fuente evidently hadn't given up yet. So he attacked early, extraordinarily early, already on Passo Valles, together with Lascano and Farisato, and he continued alone towards Passo Giau. Reporters wondered if it hadn't been a mistake. Did he calculate his energy correctly? Would he be able to keep up that pace until the end? Would his ambitious plan work? Or was it destined to meet the failure of a collapse? To imagine this feat, it's good to remember that at the time they used to race with different bikes from the modern, heavier ones with 6 rear gears. Coppi had climbed the Stelvio with 4623, while today they can also climb with 3430. It's hard, but Fuente resisted and amazed the reporters for his speed, his endurance, and for his demeanor with which he climbed. No trace of tiredness could be seen on his face. He dominated for 111 kilometers. The Grand Prix of the mountain was his, alone with a focused gaze and yellow jersey, followed by the white car with the roof open, from which the operator emerged with a large video camera firmly held on his shoulder. On Passo Giau, the fans waited and approached through the meadows, applauding and encouraging him. He made it to Passo Tre Croci, up to Auronzo. Passo Giau became the Spanish episode of a season dominated by the Belgian. It was the exception that proves the rule, and perhaps the very first sign of the end of the age of the cannibal. For one day, he wasn't the undisputed protagonist. Only for one day, though. In Trieste, Merckx finished first, almost 8 minutes ahead of Gimondi, and just over 10 ahead of Battaglin. Passo Giau in 1973 contained in itself the proof of Merckx's infallibility, but also the end of his undisputed superiority, which would be seen from the following year. It was Fuente's moment, who flew uphill challenging the champion. It was the baptism of Francesco Moser, and Gimondi remained capable of greatness in any situation. The cannibal left the scene as he entered it, proving to be great and unattainable. In 1974, he won the Giro, but struggling. His first place was no longer as obvious as it had been until the previous year. The racers, the public, and the journalists noticed that the time when he always won everything was perhaps at its end. It was as if he were running again with the others, descending from Mount Olympus where he'd been up to that moment. So, the last of the 5 Giros where he would win was also the hardest fought. The Spaniard Fuente was still on the road with him in 1974 and finished 5th that year, and would wear the Maglia Rosa for 12 days before handing it over to the cannibal. But there was also the 20-year-old Italian Baronchelli, who just deservedly entered among the pros. There was Gimondi, who would finish in 3rd place. The general standings no longer showed those sensational gaps, which were measured in minutes. Among the first, there was even less of a gap. The Belgian was first, yet only 12 seconds ahead of the climber from Mantua. 12 seconds, a distance that sounds unbelievable. Paradoxically, precisely his most suffered and tiring year, precisely the least obvious victory, was also the most beautiful for those who follow cycling. In the year in which Merckx returned to compete as a mere human, the race went from the amazement of his results to that atmosphere of bated breath, waiting to find out who'd make it. Exciting. That's how the year's described, because the champion didn't just win by beating the others, he had to fight. The Belgian, who found himself competing for real that year, would probably define it differently. He also won the Tour, by the way, a conclusion worthy of someone like Eddy Merckx, one who's won 3 world championships, 5 tours, 5 laps, 7 Milan-San Remo, and 1 Vuelta, just to mention some of his triumphs. Champions, even those like Merckx, pass. The climbs remain. Many years later, on that same Passo Giau, another rider won the heart of the bike enthusiasts. Egan Bernal came from the Andes, and at the age of just 22, he won the Tour. At the 2021 Giro, he soon became known as Bernal Cachol, showing that on climbs he had different legs and lungs. He was born where the air is thin. Zipaquirá is 2,650 meters above sea level. That is his environment. In Cortina d'Ampezzo, he asserted his dominance. That stage was removed after the GPM due to the weather, so the ranking had to be based on the arrivals at the uphill climb. It was enough to understand that he was made of something different. On Passo Giau, which in the meantime had become Cima Coppi, he had the opportunity to show what he could do, all the way. He had a special relationship with those roof-of-the-world heights. The solitude that accompanied him through the snow of the whitewashed pass and then down along the damp asphalt between the evergreens and the low clouds speaks volumes. He was a black rocket, the color of his bike, and of the Ineos poncho he wore to protect himself from the rain, straight towards the first place. The king of Passo Giau, they would write, setting a new record, 32 minutes and 45 seconds to complete those 9.8 kilometers. That day on Passo Giau, Egan Bernal showed who he really was in the last meters upon arrival. He had time to undo his dark poncho, to take it off, raise his arms in triumph, and cross the finish line like this, alone as he wanted to. Amidst the general cheer, the Giro was his. A few months later, in January 2022, tragedy struck. While training in Colombia on a time trial bike, Bernal collided with a bus that had stopped in the street at a crazy speed of 60 kilometers per hour. The impact was awful. He ended up on the ground and risked the worst. There was a fear of something irreparable. The damage was very serious. He broke his femur, his kneecap. There was a cervical trauma as a result of hitting his head violently, and he suffered a chest trauma with lung perforation. 5 operations were needed in just over a week, and then intensive care, to avoid the most catastrophic hypotheses. Bernal got back on his feet. Yes, he would walk again. And he did even more than that. Just over a month after the accident, he started training not only to walk again, but also to get back into the competition. An answer worthy of Bernal Catchall, king of Passo Giau, the champion who'd already put the Giro and a Tour in his palmarès. This is what cycling is made of, men and their stories. It's made of Egan Bernal and his victories and his miraculous recovery. It's made of Binder and Girardengo, Coppi and Bartali, and then Gimondi and Merckx. And perhaps Merckx was wrong. It's true, whoever is fastest wins. But cycling is much more than that. It's also made up of what remains outside the rankings and happens after the finish line. And all that still contributes to its greatness. For example, when the Cannibal and Gimondi went back to being simply Eddie and Felice, sharing the road, but not only that. They knew each other, and the rivalry of the race faded towards friendship. They showed mutual esteem and respect in many ways. At the time of Gimondi's death, many years later, Merckx would say, "This time, it's me losing. Goodbye, dear friend." This is cycling. In Cima, the greatest Giro d'Italia climbs, is a Giro d'Italia podcast produced by Dog Ear, starring Daniel Tanner, executive producer Marta Donà and Carlo Lenotti. Written by Valentina Camarini, with the editorial support of Giacomo Botto. Directed by Marco Ferrarini. Producer Irene Oriani. Sound design and original music by Pasquale Lo Savio. Recording Dario Cuomo. Artwork Andrea Lodetti. English adaptation Diego Ferrarini. Special thanks to Silvia Forestieri, Eva Visentin and Simone Pozzi.
Una produzione Dog Ear.